Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today on this beautiful, it seems like we skipped through spring to go right to summer, this beautiful afternoon. After these commercial messages. I think you're in for a real treat today. The college is really honored and grateful to have a writer and a poet and a thinker of the quality of Martha Collins here today. Those of you studying creative writing, this should be a really inspirational day for you. So on behalf of the administration and the institution, I'd like to thank you for coming to join us and to share with us, and thank you all for coming to the presentation today.
Thanks, Matthew. Welcome, everybody, to this MCC Visiting Writers Series with Martha Collins. I'm Tom Laughlin of the Creative Writing Program, and I want to welcome you from our Creative Writing Program, and this is jointly sponsored by the Liberal Arts Division, which Matthew is head of, as well as the Office of Student Engagement. So I want to thank Steve Rossi of the Office of Student Engagement, who supports this work, as well as Joe Keller of the English Department, Francois de Costard, who's helping with his interns doing some videoing here today, Beth Noel of our marketing area, and Stephen Yancey, who will be here a little later from our bookstore. So we'll hear from Martha Collins, read some poetry, question and answer period. We will raffle off some books. If you have not filled out a raffle slip, please track down. Do you have some, Neil? Neil over there, we've got a box to throw yours in. Want to give away books at the end. Anybody need a raffle ticket who was here, who hasn't filled out a raffle ticket for a free book? Okay, yeah, go grab one over there. Maybe can you hand one? You've got a bunch, don't you?
Yes.
Can you hand this gentleman one? That would be great. And the box is over there. We'll collect at the end. I'm really excited to have Martha Collins here. It's a particular joy for me because Martha was a professor of mine many years ago, as well as Professor McClellan's, and so nice to have you on our beautiful Bedford campus. Martha Collins is a poet, a translator, a teacher, a scholar. She has published 11 books of poetry, most recently Casualty Reports, published in October by the University of Pittsburgh Press. Her previous book just before that, Because What Else Could I Do, won the Poetry Society of America's William Carlos Williams Award. Her other books include 3 works that focus on race and racism in this country. Admit One, an American Scrapbook, which was published by Pittsburgh in 2016. White Papers, also by University of Pittsburgh Press in 2012. And Blue Front in 2006 by Graywolf. She's also an active translator and has co-translated 4 books of Vietnamese poetry, with a 5th co-translated with Nguyen Ba Chung, book that is pre-copy here, Dreaming the Mountain Poems by Wei C.E. It's coming out in June. She co-edited with Kevin Proofer an anthology Into English Poems, Translations, Commentaries in 2017 with Graywolf. She also co-edited other anthologies, including 2 volumes of the Unsung Masters series on Wendy Batin and Kathy Breese Davis, and a volume of essays on the poet Jane Cooper in 2019. Her poems have appeared widely in national, international journals and magazines, as well as many anthologies, including Ghost Fishing and Eco-Justice Poetry Anthology, edited by Melissa Tuckey, and published by the University of Georgia in 2018, and Poetry 180, A Turning Back to Poetry, an anthology of contemporary poets that was edited by Billy Collins, no relation, the former Poet Laureate of the United States, published by Random House in 2003. Martha Collins has won many awards, honors, grants, fellowships, including the Alice Faye D. Castanola Award, the Lawrence Goldstein Poetry Prize, and 3 Pushcart Prizes. Residency grants from the Lenin Foundation, the Siena Art Institute, and the Santa Fe Art Institute and Women's International Study Center. Fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts, the Bunting Institution, Ingrid Merrill Foundation, and the Witter Bynner Foundation, among others. She was born in Omaha, Nebraska, raised in Iowa. She earned a BA from Stanford University and a PhD at the University of Iowa. She founded the creative writing program at U.Mass Boston, where I was honored to study with her. She served as the Pauline Delaney Professor of Creative Writing at Oberlin College in Ohio for 10 years, where she was editor of the Oberlin College Press and also editor-at-large of Field magazine. She's a professor emerita at Oberlin College, currently teaches short-term workshops at this point. The AWP Chronicle, which is a journal of the Association of Writers and Writing Programs, the poet Cynthia Hogue has described Martha Collins as, quote, a dazzling poet whose poetry is poised at the juncture between the lyric and ethic, and who has addressed some of the most traumatic social issues of the 20th century in supple and complex poems. Those who have followed Collins' books have long since realized that no subject is off limits for her piercing intellect. In his recent review of her most current book, Casualty Reports, the journal North of Oxford Review, the writer and editor Charles Ramelkamp says, the poems in Casualty Reports shine a light on the casual cruelties the powerful inflict upon the vulnerable, the exploitation, the inhumanity, the total lack of empathy. The tone is necessarily elegiac, but the verse is written in a style that is at once elusive and expository, suggestive and explicit. In describing her work, the poet Kevin Proofer has said, Martha Collins delves into the shiftiness of gender, the power of romantic love, the nature of the divine, the troubles of American national identity, and the certainty of mortality. Musically brilliant, psychologically intricate, movingly humane, Martha Collins is one of our most vital poets. Please help me welcome Martha Collins.
Gosh, did I do all that? It's a great pleasure to be here to meet you, whom I have not met, and to be here with my former students who are now professors. That is a real thrill. Thank you, Tom, thank you, Middlesex, thank you, everybody else that you thanked. So I'm going to read mostly from this new book that Tom mentioned, Casualty Reports. But I want to begin with this book of translations by a Vietnamese Buddhist monk, Toi Si. It's a book that I co-translated with Nguyen Ba Chung, also of U.Mass Boston, the Joiner Institute there. It won't be officially published till May, but just this week I got my pre-pub copies. They're a little messed up, so I can't do anything except read from them. But this is the first time I have ever read from this book, so it's very exciting to me. I'm going to read you just a little bit of biography about Toi Si, and then I'll read 3 poems. Born in 1943, Toi Si joined the Buddhist order at age 10. That's fairly typical. A scholar of Eastern and Western philosophy, he's published numerous works on Buddhism and other subjects, as well as translations. He's recognized as one of the most important Buddhist scholars in Vietnam. During what we think of as the Vietnam War, he retreated to the forest and began to have a dream of his politically divided country, which he envisioned as a peak in the Cheong Sun mountain range. That's what's sort of depicted on the cover of this book. After the war, he was imprisoned from 1978 to 1980, and again from 1984 to 1998 for his refusal to take sides in the conflict of his country. He's lived in Ho Chi Minh City ever since his release, and I'm particularly moved by these poems as our own country becomes increasingly divided in its political factions. So the first poem of his that I will read was written before the war, but thinking about what was happening. And it gives a little bit of biography of Tracy's life. The years away. The wind gave you 10 long years of wandering, seeing your country only in its ruin. The eastern city still whispers to white sand, tales of compassion, breath of a chilling sun. 10 more years you were silent in the city. Love for the forest brought you close to tears. Arms reached for the sky, the birds late chirping. Life adrift, small wings closing up by the road. 10 years later, you crossed streams and forests, saw your country as bloody, abandoned fields. Evening smoke fades like wounded souls. Each river, each stream of blood and tears overflows. For 10 years, you forgot your reed-thin weakness. On slender shoulders, a new country rose. You bent your head to hear mountain and forest, chanting the endless love song of the East. The day you came back to the ancient city, roads were still shadowed with sorrow's smoke. Eyes still shone with timeless indignation, as fresh as rain on the borderlands, as true. And this next poem was written as Tracy realized that he was going to be heading to prison soon, and was indeed there for 14 years. Descending the mountain. Tomorrow the monk will descend the mountain, a frayed thin robe on his shoulders. Prayer beads consume the years. No incense reaches the drinkers. At dawn, the monk will descend the mountain, his white hair vexed by labor. In the east, the sun will be red. No clouds fly in summer. Tomorrow, the monk will descend the mountain, the city whose last impasse. Now he coughs in the darkness. The temple grows deep and vast. At dawn, the monk will descend the mountain, tears at the rims of his eyes. Because the monk loves darkness, nightmares wait on the forest path. And the last little poem by Tracy that I'll read is a little quatrain that was written while he was in prison. Dedication. Two hands lift the prison bowl of rice to dedicate it to the Lord of all. World overflowing with blood and strife. Bowl raised as wordless tears fall. Tracy. So now I will turn to my most recent book called Casualty Reports. There are various kinds of casualties and losses that are talked about in the book, but the most common use of the term casualty reports, of course, is in reference to war. And so I want to begin by reading a couple of poems about war. The first of them, I realize this goes back before most of you were born, but about that war that Tracy witnessed so intimately. This is what I was doing during the same period. Not being there. While we bedded each other in sleeping bags on the floors of apartments, offices, while we wrote, typed, cranked the Mino ditto machines, passed out leaflets, flyers, cards. While we gathered in public places with posters and blankets and dope and music and felt all right as we never felt in childhood or adolescence, felt alive as we never felt. People our age were losing things, arms and legs, innocence, sanity, girlfriends, wives, buddies, boyfriends, husbands, lives, children, families, babies, villages, ways, and means of life. And though we knew it was true, it was as we know some things we read aren't true. We knew few of our own dead, knew nothing of how they cherished theirs. We didn't even know they wrote poems. And this second poem that I'll read from the war section was written in 2009 when Gaza was under siege. And I'm reading it now thinking again and continually of Israel-Palestine and also of Ukraine. For Gaza. For the woman who cooks on the fire of sticks and boards beside her shell of a house, her bag of clothes in a tree. For physician Ani al-Jarrah, his wife cut in half, his year-old son turned to pieces. For the 30 dead Samuni family members dug out of the rubble, for the living, including children who clutched dead mothers. For the schools and mosques and homes destroyed by bombs, for the graves disturbed by tanks. For the more than 1,300 dead, including those who walked from their homes as directed with white flags. For those going home to water their trees, lemon and almond and olive, and for those trees. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn to the major sequence of this book. And I'll sort of do these straight through. You don't need to do this because it's a sequence. And it's evolved because of my own family involvement with coal mining. And I will come to that part of the sequence in a minute. But I'm going to start, I did quite a bit of research for this. Found out a lot about how coal developed and so forth. So I'm going to go back all the way to the prehistory of coal. Overburden is a term that you'll hear in several of these poems. It refers to everything that's on top of the coal, which you either have to dig down into or kick the overburden off to get rid of so you can get to the coal. More about that later too. Grave. It is all over the earth, under earth, a graveyard. Tree ferns, trees, roots, bark, seeds, ancient life that emerged from the sea, forests flooded to swamps and bogs, transformed to peat, transformed again, sunk, covered layers of earth with strange amphibian, snake, and later dinosaur bones. Layers and layers, and under it all, for hundreds of millions of years, our ancestors resting under earth, overburdened, we say, until we found them. This next one leaps ahead a few thousand years, thousands, and the revolution, as you'll see in the poem that's referred to in the title, is the Industrial Revolution. And the revolution we call the coal to power steam engines, to pump water and lift coal, to sell or use to power steam. Coal to coke for furnaces, to smelt iron, to make tools, and furnaces to smelt for rails. Trains to transport coal, to power steam engines, to power trains, and boats to transport coal. Harness the power of, raised to the power of power. And now I will turn back to my family in Southern Illinois. In Illinois. My father's father's father had a share in the Enterprise line, the Enterprise Coal and Coke Company, 1871. He was a shareholder, being a coal digger, kept a log of entries, shafts, and air shafts, rooms by number and number of feet. Died 1881. My father's father went down to a river town to work, came back to the mining town where his father went down in the Paradise mine, a miner, and later a mine examiner tested the air, the face, and the roof, Sundays and holidays, to walk 3 miles out and back when there was no train. My father, whose mother kept him out of the mines, kept his father's oil lamp, kept his father's carbide and safety lamps, kept a box of wicks, picks, globes, kept his father's 50-year union pen, his first aid pen, his flashlight safe for use, manuals, papers. This lamp was given, all labeled. This pen was given, kept it all. It was his legacy, labeled dated 1965, and signed and kept for me. Ooh. When I was 10, they took me into a coal mine. I gave a report to our class that had seen How Green Was My Valley, a movie set in Wales. The miners had lamps, like my grandfather's lamps, and I never forgot the whistle, explosion, the father trapped and killed, but I had forgotten the wage cuts, the strike, the lost jobs, the immigration to countries like our own. And this next poem, the title, as you'll see, is the title, is the name of my parents' hometown, DuQuoin. In my family's town, which was also Ruby Goodman's town, there were accidents, there were explosions, there were strikes. But although the miners armed themselves at least once against rumored strikebreakers, the union, which mentioned houses before it joined the UMWA, succeeded without violence and became one of the largest locals with over 1,000 members, including Ruby's black father, for a time the union president. You have to join the union, he said. Everyone does. Every man has the same voice, white, black, gray, no big eyes, no little U's. But despite that, there were problems about race and union violence in Southern Illinois, and this next poem is about that. It's in 2 parts, and most of the second part repeats absolutely, or almost absolutely, lines from the first part, but it's a different perspective. Southern Illinois, well, you'll see. Mother Jones, I know, was a very famous union organizer. Verdon, the name of the town. Verdon. 1. And back in 1898, up north in Verdon, while blacks brought in from Birmingham to break a union strike were still on the train. 8 union miners and 5 guards were killed, and 35 miners and 5 guards wounded, and 1 or more strikebreakers wounded. After which, Mother Jones asked to be buried in the Union Miners Cemetery, established for Vernon strikers who gave up their lives. They are responsible, she said, for Illinois being the best organized labor state in America. 2. And back in 1898, up north in Verdon, when blacks were brought in from Birmingham to break a strike they knew nothing about, 8 union miners and 5 guards were killed, and 35 miners and 5 guards wounded, and 1 or more strikebreakers wounded. after which local black union miners were threatened or segregated, and Berlin became no blacks allowed after dark, a sundown town, with one union miner in 1908 and one black household in 2000. I'll read another poem that goes back to my childhood. There's a song, I don't know when its most recent revival occurred. It was written in the 1930s by Merle Travis called 16 Tons. Does anybody know that song? Probably not. But when I was a kid, it was revived yet again, and there are, I don't know, dozens and dozens of covers of this song. But it goes, it's about coal mining, and the chorus goes, 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, because I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. So this is a poem called Store. The coal mining companies owned the store, and as you'll see in some places, the miners were required to use the store, couldn't buy anywhere else. Store. I owe my soul to the company store. When I was 14, my father heard me play that song on the record player and told me about the company store. Later, he told me about the family that owned the mine and ran the store and kept the library out of town. The mine, he said, deducted the cost of the weekday train and fuel repairs and doctor's visits from paychecks. But the miners weren't required to use the company store, as they were in towns with no other store, or towns in which, if a miner didn't use the company store, the mine could fire him. And this next poem takes its title from a 1949 book, which I found in the library, by Margaret Wise Brown, whom I'm sure some of you do know as the author of Goodnight Moon. Yes? Two little miners. Two little miners standing on the little golden book cover. One white and one black. They smile at each other. Like the Integrated Miners Union. Oh, but look inside. They wake up clean as snow, but by night they've turned black. Black as soot, night a crow, black as black, coal black. Back home, they live alone, but someone sticks their supper. Two little miners, black as night, scrubbing your tongue until you're white. Types of coal mines. We're moving closer to the present day now. Types of coal mines. At first they picked it up from the surface, but then they found it ran under the surface, and so they made open pits. But then they found it was buried too deep and constructed shafts or slopes or drifts to take them underground, where at first they blasted, but later made rooms and pillars with picks and shovels, and later with machines that made long walls that had no pillars. Meanwhile, back on the surface, they learned to strip the land of its overburden in strips or following contours, and then they learned to remove whole mountaintops, which meant using fewer people and bigger machines. So this next poem also takes its title from a children's book, or rather a series of children's books. This particular volume in that series is about a machine that lives in Germany. And the poem takes some of its content from the children's book and some of it from the website that advertises this fabulous machine. Now, that's big. Then they made the largest machine, the heaviest in the world. It's as long as 2.5 football fields It weighs 13,000 tons, has 18 buckets to excavate the overburden that covers the coal. It could fill 10,000 dump trucks per day, as much as 30,000 workers could. It's continuous, never stops. It's still uncovering 40 million tons each year to power electric stations that power much of its country, including itself. It won't stop till 2050, when all the coal in the mine where it works will be exhausted. The children's section of the library is a great place to hang out. I recommend it if you're a writer, especially looking up the books that you did as a kid. It's kind of, I had to look quite a while before I found my favorite books, which these were not among them. Anyway, a recommendation to writers. Whose lungs were lost to coal dust. Black coal to black lung, now rock dust to lungs. Whose jobs were lost to strip mines, to mining machines, to natural gas, or paid less because. Who sold mineral rights to land when farming replaced jobs. Whose farms subsided, were lost. One of the things that happened when they stripped the land of the overburden and made strip mines, which put people out of jobs, but it also meant that the land, the remaining land around there was very precarious, and so it sank, and the farms were destroyed. This is happening these days with fracking in Pennsylvania, for example. So we're up into the present now. Burning. The mercury, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides from burning coal that fill our air and fall upon us as acid rain. The selenium, arsenic, lead from coal ash stored in coal ash ponds that leak and spill and pollute our waters. But most of all, the carbon dioxide released by burning that captures heat, that warms our air and melts our glaciers, lifts our seas and warms them, dries our land and fuels fires, strengthens rainfalls and hurricanes that swell our waters and generate floods. All of which threaten our coasts and cities, our islands and whole nations, consume our animals, plants, insects, and fish. Whole species, including most likely our own, unless. And this is the last poem I'll read from this whole sequence and from this book, but then I'm going to end with two newer poems. Blessing. Where we dug up the graves of black slaves who mined the first coal in Illinois. Where we desecrated the graves of indigenous people that covered coal in the Southwest. Where we dug up animals, plants in their graves and burned them as oil and gas and coal. There and throughout our earth, let us grieve for the graves we robbed, and then let us bless the graves of the dead that remain, and over them for the living, the wind, the sun. So I'm going to change gears, shift gears, and read two recent poems, which are both love poems. They both, kind of by coincidence, I didn't plan it that way, but they both reference astronomy. This first one is called Arcturus, and you'll find out lots about Arcturus in the poem. There's a reference to Ursa Major, which is the Great Bear constellation in the sky, which I refer to by the Latin name, Ursa Major. Because my friend, who knows much about many things, had written Arcturus, I looked up Arcturus, which I knew was right, and yes, it's the brightest star in our northern sky. But because my friend made it seem it was complicated, like something more, I kept looking, and yes, it's a red giant, and yes, it's an aging star, but no. And so I considered the source of its name, Bear Watcher, which refers to a myth, it's complicated, and the star's place in the sky near Ursa Major. And although watching a bear that was once your mother might hold some interest, that was a place neither I nor my friend, I'm sure, would want to go. And although another possible source of the name is a myth about wine, and this made me recall some delightful evenings I'd spent with my friend, I decided no, he'd probably written Arcturus only because, if it wasn't because, of the bright star thing. But by then, I'd read that Arcturus was one of the first stars ever named, and that it was called, in various times and places, a pillar of sky, the sword, the pearl, the keeper of heaven, as well as, and now I thought of my friend, the owl, the clear sky, and also the star of gladness, the star of joy. So this next one is the last poem I'll read, and thank you all for being here. I don't know if you've seen these, they're about this big. It's a moonlight that's a globe, it lights up from the inside, and it has the contours of the moon's valleys and so forth on it. So that's the major moon referred to here, or the one in the sky is also referenced. Last one up. And then again, as if that tune played on for us, you know the one, the last we played. Turned out the moon was playing too, a big balloon against the busy, foolish sun. That line again, that same old tune. And so it went, with sun at noon and moon at night, till night was done and early sun turned out the moon. By then, though, we'd become immune to shifty time. Once we'd begun, we couldn't stop the throbbing tune our playing made. And in our room, our moon went on it spun, turned on and on, our little moon. Our play is done for now, and soon we'll sleep. But first, a taskful one in answer to our one-line tune. Last one up, turns out, the moon. Thank you.
Well, questions?
Yeah.
Time for reflections and questions. I think that people have some for Martha, and maybe some ones that the poems got you thinking about, and that you have to ask of this wonderful poem.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Sheree. Nice to meet you. Thank you for sharing us with your poetry. And I just have to ask, I love that sort of balance that you have with educating yourself before even getting into your poetry. So I just asked, how do you find that feeling to make the poetry? You have the information, but just now it's like you tap into your memories, and it kind of like formulates that poem. That's interesting.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Are you in the class that I'm?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, well, I'll probably
That's
say
the
more.
time.
I'll say more about that, but I'll say this much now. So, whenever I'm doing stuff that involves a lot of research, it always starts with something personal. And that was certainly the case here. In that poem about my grandparents, my father, this was a mining town. The boys did not graduate high school. They went down in the mines when they were in their teens, early mid-teens. But my father, though he didn't go down in the mines, was very proud of his father and grandfather, who had, despite the fact that it was a difficult life. And he had said, I have 4 lamps that my great-grandfather and my grandfather carried into the mines. And I have all of this other stuff that my father labeled meticulously. And these are the wicks that went into the lamps. This is your grandfather's union pin, all of that. And I have had that stuff for a long time. I also had a conversation with my father, which I took notes about some time ago, and this stuff floated around in my consciousness for a long time before I thought to do anything about it. And then I think the next thing that happened was first I sort of became aware of how coal mining was threatened by all these machines that were taking over. And then, of course, I became aware of the climate crisis that coal was producing. There's a poem in here I didn't read, though I could, about the climate change conference in 2018 that was held in a coal mining town. And people were defending coal at a climate change conference. So anyway, all that sort of added together, and I didn't know what to do about this. And so I started researching and finding out about coal mining in Southern Illinois, where my family lived. And then this is what I do. At some point, I started writing stuff down, long before I knew what I was going to do with it. So that is how I proceed all the time. That I'm finding things out and I'm writing things down at the same time. And sometimes I'm writing I don't know, and sometimes I find out things that answer the questions. But if I don't have a personal connection to this stuff, I really can't do it. I'll talk more about that in the class if you want to.
Yeah.
But that's really how it works. And I'll talk more in the class, or I could do it now. We'll see if anybody else has questions about how I got into doing this stuff in the first place. But the personal and the larger issue stuff is always connected to me, and that's why there's humor in it. Otherwise, I wouldn't care. And the other thing, you're all in college, right? So you know how to write research papers, right? So you do your research. You get all your research done, and then you write your paper. That is not how I write poems. Because you already know what you're going to say when you do that, and you don't discover things. So I do exactly what I was taught not to do when I was doing research, which was to write when I didn't know a whole lot. So that's another part.
That's awesome.
Any other questions? Joe?
I remember when your father came to visit us at U.Mass.
Wow.
Wow!
When you said, my hearing isn't what it used to be, but when you were talking about the 3 generations of fathers, I was thinking of Seamus Heaney digging, and this is his birthday.
Oh, it is! Happy birthday, James Lee. And if you don't know his poem about digging, you should.
Yeah.
You can look it up. My father came to your class.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'd forgotten my father did that.
Yeah, I remember.
Oh my goodness. Oh, I'm so moved by that. My father was a pharmacist. He went to pharmacy school. He worked in a drugstore starting when he was 10 and saved enough money to go to pharmacy school for 2 years, which is all you needed back then. And wanted to become a doctor, but didn't have enough money. So he wanted me to become a doctor, but I didn't want to be a doctor. What about being a lawyer? Maybe.
You can become a doctor of the soul.
So I kept disappointing him. And finally, I started teaching at U.Mass Boston. And my father said, oh, great. Now you can be the college president. And then I said, well, what I'm really going to do is write poetry. And at some point he said, why couldn't you be like those people we see on TV who get famous by publishing these really popular books? I said, I really couldn't do that. Because it turned out, when I published my first book, the person who was most proud and pleased was my father. And he was equally pleased to come to your class. Thanks for reminding me. Yes, back there.
So, I guess, first, you were just talking there, it just reminded me of Major Jackson, and he said something, he said that don't write what you know, write what you want to know. And when you said that, I thought that's,
Yeah.
you're saying, it's
Yeah.
brilliant and true. It's really, I thought that was awesome.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
very curious about your sort of, is writing a daily part of your life? Is it just something like, is that your daily process, you just write every day, or is it different than that?
Sometimes it's like that. When I was at U.Mass Boston, I don't know, you weren't there, neither one of us there then. but-
I graduated from U.Mass Boston, so I won't take that.
When did you graduate?
My wife did, I didn't graduate, but she graduated with her master's in public history in 2015.
Okay. Somewhere between these guys and that, a friend of mine and I became co-chairs of the English department, which was an insane thing to do, but I knew it was going to be crazy. It was, you guys know, a really big English department. And I made a vow that I was going to write for an hour a day, all the time, that I was doing that, which I did for 3 years. And I was faithful about that. I wasn't always writing original poems. I was translating, which doesn't take quite so much, originality, but you're still using your skills. One night I had to go to school early. I came home. I fell asleep at my desk at 11 p.m. trying to do my hour. So I did that for that period. And I still write every day when I'm obsessed with something. When I was writing these whole poems, that's what I did. I mean, it's... but then I don't write. When I run out of something, and I usually know that because the poems are getting kind of, then I just don't write for a while. And I sort of let, it's fallow, it's a fallow time, but it's a time when I'm reading and taking stuff in, and then out of nowhere, which happened this week, will come something, I think, oh my gosh, I have to write a poem about that. So it's a mix, and I'm either completely obsessive or I'm not, or whatever. I'm always grateful when I'm happiest when I'm writing all the time. But I do okay otherwise. And yes?
So, do you think because you said you had the balance between your personal and your education, do you think that's where poetry is separate from different types of writing, where it really relies on that personal attachment to the subject? Like developing that personal attachment?
That's a good question. I think deeply that's true. But for some poets, it's not obvious at all. And for some poets, it's just not true. There's a guy, this stuff that I do where I use a lot of research, and when I started doing it back in 20 years ago, it didn't have a name, but now they talk about documentary poetics. So there's a guy who's way, way out there in the documentary poetry department. In fact, one of his books is about coal. But he does nothing in some of his poems and in this entire book except quote stuff. He collages all this stuff. And he has a poem that collages several things. It collages a grammar book that he was teaching for a remedial English course, about how to make sentences and stuff, plus some stuff about a union strike, plus some stuff about Ronald Reagan on TV advertising, gosh, what was it, GE or Westinghouse, I can't remember. Anyway, nothing. But then he told me that there was a personal connection for him for everything. He was teaching for that book. His mother worked for GE. I can't remember the other one, but I think if you're really going to go someplace with a poem, having something in there is really important. And for me, it's pretty much always true. That, when I get into the researchy part, of course, I'm not there anymore, but it's usually something. And then that balancing is the trick. Okay? Anybody else? Yes?
What pushed you to gravitate towards translating books?
Okay, U.Mass Boston. When you were there, some veterans founded a group in the 1980s, and they were Vietnam vets. And they started a summer workshop. And for 2 weeks every summer, they would bring Vietnam vets who were teachers, people like Tim O'Brien, some of you may have heard. And then they would have students who were Vietnam vets, and that's all they had for a few years. And then at some point, the director of that Joyner, later called the Joyner Institute for the Study of War and Social Consequences, came to me. I was directing a creative writing program and said we should cooperate, we should apply for some grants. And by the way, we need somebody in our 2-week session to teach translation. And I said, what? I had translated some stuff. I had no idea how to teach translation. And of course, I was teaching it to people who didn't even necessarily have a second language. And so it was really just about how do you go about doing this stuff. Well, the Joyner every year would bring writers from Vietnam to the workshop. And one of them that summer, and they would give readings, and one of them that summer came to my workshop. He had some English, and he had some very, very rough versions of his own English versions of his Vietnamese poems. And he said, can you help me? And I said, yeah. So I sort of cleaned them up, and then he went back to Vietnam. And he left me a bunch of his rough translations and the originals. And I started looking at them and discovered that some of the translations were shorter than the poems. So I wrote him and I said, well, why are you, I bought a dictionary so I could see what was missing, sort of. And happily, the French missionaries had put the Vietnamese language into the Roman alphabet so I could at least look stuff up. I didn't know how to say it. So I said, so why did you leave out all those lines? And he said, I didn't know how to translate them. So that fall, I ended up sitting in on a course, just sitting in, 5 days a week at Harvard, a beginning Vietnamese class. And I learned enough Vietnamese to be able to struggle through the poems myself. I'm not fluent at all, but I got completely hooked on this stuff. And this was partly because, as that poem I read suggested, I was a war protester when I was very young, and in the Vietnam War, and it was wonderful to discover, oh my gosh, all these poems were being written while we were having a war over there, and I didn't even know that. And so I've been doing that ever since. And it's been kind of wonderful. I always, when I'm working on some translations, I can always write. That's what I did when I was working too hard for my university. Because you can sit down with somebody else's poem and you can work on making your poem the same way you work on your own poem, but you don't have to make it up. So it's always there, and it has given me just a wonderful insight into Vietnamese people and the Vietnamese country. I've been there 5 times, I think, since then. I've translated from other languages too, but this is kind of taken over. So that's how and that's why. Is anybody in here, do you have another language, anybody in here? If you have another language, translating is a great thing. And it helps your own work. And it helps your language. If you're not absolutely fluent, you really get into the nuts and bolts of how a language works, and that's pretty exciting. Anybody else? Yes.
I know you published about 11 books at this point. How did you first get into publishing, like the first couple of times? What was that process like?
Horrible. Really horrible. I mean, you know, I'm a pretty shy person, and I, you know, didn't go out into the world and meet people particularly, and so I just started sending off this manuscript, and people said, "Oh, this is really fabulous," but it's not really quite what we want. You know, all those nice, polite little things, they're called rejection letters. So it was a struggle, and my first 5 books were all published by different publishers. Now I have a couple of publishers, and so it's, now I kind of send them manuscripts, and that's it. But it's kind of tough. Starting small is very good, and you have, if you're not aware of this, I think I'm saying everything I was going to say to this class, but that's okay, right? You have a literary magazine. And if you publish in that student literary magazine, you're going to have a bigger audience than I have for a lot of poems that I publish in literary magazines. Because you've got everybody here. You've got a campus. This goes campus wide, right? So, some of you, I guess, are on the staff. I don't know how all this works. We can talk about that in class later. But we should start there. Just start there, and when you meet people, don't be shy as I was. If you publish a magazine, talk to them, work your way through. It's not the funnest part. One trouble with being a writer as opposed to being a teacher is that the gratification, the external gratification, is not instant. You know. I used to teach a class and I'd be really happy and I'd walk out of there and that was instant. I write a poem and I feel a little of that, I feel something, I feel that, it feels great. But then I get this no. It's like, you know, student evaluations every time the poems come back. But it's just part of the territory, and you're in this with everybody else. So, anything else?
Well, I think just because of time,
Yeah, we
I
should raffle.
wanted to do a raffle and all that
Yes.
sort of thing. I want to maybe another round of applause for